Hi, this is Claudia Noriega-Bernstein, and you're listening to Don't Shrink to Fit podcast. Every week I have an incredible woman as my guest, someone who shares her personal journey, her expertise, or both. And this week, we get the best of both worlds. I am joined by Mallary Tenore, journalist, professor, and author of Sleep, Life in the Middle of Eating Disorder Recovery. Mallary shares her deeply personal journey with anorexia, the grief that led to it, and the lessons she learned about healing, resilience, and self-compassion. We will talk about the myth surrounding eating disorders, how diet culture impacts our kids, and why recovery isn't about perfection, it's about progress. If you have ever wondered what it really takes to heal and how to support someone in the messy in-between spaces of recovery, this conversation will give you the insight and hope you've been looking for. Stay connected, follow me on Instagram, and don't forget to subscribe to this show so you never miss an episode. Welcome, Mallary. So great to have you here.
Thank you so much for having me.
This is a very interesting subject for me, and I had a guest in my show a while ago, probably a year and a half ago, that talked about specifically eating disorder. And this subject is meaningful to me because I had an eating disorder when I was a teenager. I have anorexia nervosa. And it was very hard to diagnose because they thought I had bulimia. So they thought I would make myself throw up every time I would go and throw up. And I was like, I'm not making myself throw up. I just can't keep the food inside of me. But it got to a point that I was unrecognizable. And in my country, I am a public figure, so people could see the difference. You know, if I would do an interview or I was on TV, they could see that my cheeks were, and my expression in my eyes was different. And I was keeping my private life very private, but it was because of a very abusive relationship that I didn't know how to deal with. So my body was taking care of my emotions. So I am very grateful that you are promoting this book and you wrote this book and the insight that this book can provide to a lot of people that have this myth about eating disorder. You know, sometimes you see somebody that is a little not as skinny and you don't understand that that person also might be going through an eating disorder. So before we even get into the book, I want to give you the opportunity to talk about how you developed your eating disorder and what was happening in your life, if you don't mind sharing, because I want my audience to understand that it can come from different places.
Mm-hmm. Yes. Well, thank you for sharing your story about your own lived experience. And I just appreciate your vulnerability with that because it's not always easy to talk about eating disorders. And my eating disorder started when I was 12 years old. So my mother had been sick with metastatic breast cancer for about 3 years. And we always held on to hope that she was going to be okay. And we always would talk about how she was a soldier in a battle and she was going to come out the other side victorious. But when the cancer spread to her bone marrow and then her liver and her brain, she ultimately didn't make it. And so when I was 11, she died. And I continued to hold on to this narrative that even though my mom ended up not being okay, I had to be okay in the aftermath of her death. And so I tried to put on a happy face and I went to school the day after she died. I read the eulogy at her funeral. But behind that happy facade, I felt like my whole world was falling apart and I didn't know how to cope with that. And it seemed like the more time passed, the farther I felt from my mother. And at the same time, I was taking a health class in elementary or middle school where we were learning about what we should and shouldn't eat. And the teacher was telling us about good foods and bad foods and telling us to avoid certain foods that had higher contents of fat or sugar. So I was beginning to realize that what I put into my body could change the way it looked. And that coupled with this desire to be closer to my mother led me to think about this idea that maybe if I stayed the same size my mom was when, or stayed the same size that I was when my mom was alive, I could somehow be closer to her. So for me as a 12-year-old, food restriction was never about trying to be skinny. It was really about trying to be small and safe and to just feel closer to my mother. And so that then very quickly descended into an eating disorder. So I didn't go into it thinking I'm going to develop an eating disorder because it's never really a conscious choice. It's often some trigger or traumatic event that can then lead someone to restrict their food intake. And then once they sort of get deeper into that food restriction, it can very quickly become a life-threatening eating disorder, which is what happened with me.
Wow. How impressive, though, how our mind works. So you felt like if I stay the same, things will be the same, even though your mom wasn't around, but it was kind of holding that space, that time, and like a time machine to an extent. But you were harming yourself in the process because you were not allowing yourself to develop. And there, like I was saying earlier, there is a lot of times that we don't understand the eating disorder, and we don't think that somebody is suffering from an eating disorder. We see somebody working out or prepping food, or I don't eat this, or I only eat that, or I cut the sugar, or I cut the carbs. And some people do it because it's good for their health. Some other people just do it because they want to be skinny, or because they have body dysmorphia, or because they just don't like themselves, or because they don't feel included or accepted, and they feel that if they're skinnier or they have a different shape or size, people are going to like them better. So what do you, if I want to pick your brain about this, do you think that there is a predisposition for an eating disorder?
Yes, I do. And just in researching my book, I learned a little bit more about this because there are temperament traits that many people with eating disorders do tend to share. And so those are kind of hardwired in us. And our temperament traits really sort of can determine a lot of how we live in this world and how we act. And so many people with anorexia nervosa, for instance, tend to be perfectionistic. They tend to be risk aversive. They tend to engage in kind of black and white thinking. And these temperament traits can really be exacerbated once someone does develop an eating disorder. And we also know that recovery doesn't mean getting rid of perfectionism or getting rid of that aversion to risk. It's more about learning how to express our temperament traits more productively instead of destructively. But certainly that plays into it. And there's also a genetic component to eating disorders as well. So we know that girls who have a parent who had anorexia are 11 times more likely to develop the disorder themselves compared to other children who don't have a parent with an eating disorder. So that also plays into it. That being said, genetics alone will never determine whether or not someone gets an eating disorder because there are genetic risk factors, but there are also genetic protective factors. And then there are environmental risk and protective factors. So there's a lot that plays into it, but there are certain predispositions that many people have when we think about eating disorders.
I want to pause this incredible conversation for a moment to speak directly to you. Yes, you, the overwhelmed, frustrated, tired of the BS mama. You're not alone in this. We all have those days. And let me be honest, sometimes those days last a little too long. But here's the good news. It can be better. I've been there. I have guided so many women like you to get out of the funk and start living the life they truly deserve. So book your call now. What are you waiting for? You're meant for more. And you know it. You feel it in your gut. And there is no more time to waste. And don't forget to grab my book, Brighter Days, available on Amazon. You will enjoy it. And I know it will speak to your heart. And you're a mom, so you are very aware of what our kids are exposed to, especially now in social media. I think to an extent, it doesn't help, because everybody puts their best face and their best pictures, and nobody know how much that picture has been edited, and they trying to mimic or emulate that image they see on social media. So as a mom, what would you tell the mom that is listening to you right now that sees that all that environment is affecting their own kids? How can we protect our kids? What narrative we need to have? What perimeters we have to take in consideration so our kids don't fall into that pattern?
Yes, it is so difficult. And I say this as a mom of a 7-year-old son and a 9-year-old daughter. So they are not yet of the age where they're actively consuming social media, but they soon will be. And so, right now, particularly as I think about their age, I try to really help them to think about how all bodies are worthy of respect, no matter how tall or how short or how big or how small. Because so often I know my children are bombarded by messages around diet culture and fat phobia. Even if we think about just the advertisements now around GLP-1 drugs, I mean, I hear those with my kids when we're driving in the car. The other night, we were streaming a movie on Disney Plus, and GLP-1 ads came up. And so I used to very quickly turn down the volume on those, but now I try to use them as discussion starters to say that there are some people who feel like they need to lose weight in order for their bodies to be healthier. But you should never feel like you need to make your own body smaller, especially not at your age. And if there's any time that someone else makes you feel like your body is not worthy, I want you to come talk to me so that we can have those conversations, because society will send you messages that your worth is dependent upon your weight. And that's really not true. When you think about your bodies help you to move through the world. They help you to take up space. They help you to run. They help you to play. So I try to really help my kids to think about what their bodies can do for them and not just have them fixate on what their bodies look like. And just an example of this, for my daughter's 9th birthday, I made her a mirror, and it's a mirror that is basically a wooden flower. And so in the center of that flower is the mirror. And then there are all these petals coming out of it. And on each petal, I painted a different word. So I said creative, loving, kind, empathetic. And I filled each petal with these different adjectives so that when my daughter looks in this mirror, which hangs on her bedroom wall, she can see not just what she looks like, but who she is. And I think that that sort of holistic approach can be really beautiful when we think about how to talk with our kids about who they are as opposed to what they look like.
And also how we talk to ourselves, because a lot of times I see kids having weight problem when they see their mom dealing with the weight problem, and how the mom said, I'm so fat, or I hate my belly, or I hate my body. And then the kid is repeating the same things. And it's so sad. I coach moms. So sometimes they come to me and they talk about their kids and what the kids are going through. And I see that she needs to work on herself first, because the kid is just emulating what she's showing up, how she's showing up. And it's so
Yes.
sad. And I wanted to touch on the Ozempic, because so many people are using Ozempic now. And I personally, I'm not a candidate, because I think that's something to do. I had thyroid cancer, and if you have something to do with the thyroid, you can use it. So it's so crazy to me how many people are using it. And also, it's so crazy to me that they don't realize that you can tell you're using it.
Mm-hmm.
Like your face shows. I don't think they're looking at their faces in the mirror. They're just looking from the neck down, and I'm shedding the weight, and that's all I care. But I go to parties or to the hockey game and whatever, and I see men or women that all have the same facial characteristics, and you can nail it. You can say Ozempic, 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 Ozempic.
Yes.
How crazy is that? It's like we are starting to look the same in our faces, and just because we want to be skinny.
Yes, it makes me think about how a lot of these weight loss drugs, in some ways, are leading to just this very kind of similar playing field for all bodies, where we're almost losing body diversity, right? Because everyone is in pursuit of this thin ideal.
Yeah.
And I think that that can be just really toxic, because there are a lot of people who may be at risk of developing an eating disorder, or maybe they've had an eating disorder in the past, but doctors aren't necessarily asking them about that and they're not screening for it. And so then you have individuals who have either a predisposition or they've had lived experience with an eating disorder, and they're put on these drugs, which can be triggering. Anecdotally, I've interviewed people who have said this was really challenging for me. And it's compounded by the fact that most medical doctors don't receive training on eating disorders. So research shows that medical doctors get 0 to 2 hours of training on eating disorders, and much more of the focus is on obesity. So as a result, many people are falling through the cracks and not getting screened, and therefore being prescribed these weight loss drugs that may be quite triggering for them. Certainly they can be helpful for some individuals, but I think we need to look more closely at who they're being prescribed to.
Yeah, I think they're trying to fix the problem and not go to the root of the problem. Why is it that you're going through this? I heard you talk in an interview about the discontent, normally discontent. Would you explain that to me, please?
Yes. So I was really fascinated by this term when I first heard it. And essentially, normative discontent is a term that researchers use to describe the reality that most men and women in our society have some level of discontent with their bodies. And research supports this notion. So it's actually more of the norm than the exception to feel bad about our bodies. And when I was interviewing one of my former medical doctors who treated me for anorexia in the late 1990s, I interviewed her a couple years ago, and she said, Mallary, she said, this is a really hard society to recover into because of this normative discontent. So to
Right.
recover from an eating disorder and to think that you're never going to have a bad body image day, or that you're never going to have some tension with the food that you're eating, is almost unrealistic when you think about the society that we live in. So I think that that's just an important reminder that we need to give ourselves grace when we think about what it means to recover, because it's very easy for people with eating disorders, who by nature tend to be more perfectionistic, to really equate full recovery with this perfectionistic ideal. And that can be paralyzing in a lot of ways, because when we think about recovery, it's not about never having bad body image days or never having distorted thoughts around
Right.
food, but it's about recognizing those thoughts when they happen, so that they don't lead to poor behavioral choices.
Absolutely. And then you also have developed like a framework for that. I believe it's called the middle place. Can you tell me a little more about that?
Yeah. So the middle place is this name that I've given to this liminal space between acute sickness and full recovery from an eating disorder. So for the longest time after I left treatment for anorexia, I felt like I needed to achieve the gold standard of full recovery. And yet I didn't really know what full recovery meant. And even the eating disorder field as a whole has not yet come to a consensus definition on what it means. There are
Right.
almost as many definitions of full recovery as there are studies about it, which can make it really confusing to know how that's even supposed to play out. And so for me, I thought it meant that I had to really kind of just be perfect at my eating, at my exercise, at school, at everything that I was doing at the time, because I wanted to be the poster child for full recovery. And I was petrified of making one wrong move, because I thought that if I slipped just once, I would immediately fall back into dangerous territory and get sick
Mm-hmm.
again. And so I was so afraid of that. But the pressure of trying to maintain this full recovery really felt insurmountable. And by the time I was a freshman in college, I ended up relapsing. But what was happening is that I had fallen into this vicious cycle of binge eating and restricting. But I was too ashamed to admit that, because I thought, well, I spent most of my teenage years in treatment. I'm supposed to be fully recovered. I'm supposed to be all better. And so I continued to tell people that I was fully recovered, when in fact I was very much struggling, and I kept that secretive. I didn't tell anyone. And that was a really hard place to be in. And I felt so much stigma and shame around that. And it got to the point where anytime I would slip, like if I were to binge eat one day, I would think, well, I might as well just keep slipping. And so then I would think, okay, I'm just going to restrict my food intake the whole next day. And so every day
Mhm.
was sort of this exercise in oscillating between a slip, which would turn into a slide, and it was slipping and sliding. And then in my late 20s, I began to reframe my thinking around recovery, around this middle place. I was working with journalists at the time and trying to help them to tell restorative narratives, which are these stories that show how people and communities move forward in the aftermath of trauma and tragedy. And these stories really explore messy middles. And as I was working with journalists, it occurred to me that this could be a really helpful framework for my own story.
Yeah.
And so I began to then think about what would it mean if I looked at slips not as these grounds for failure, but really as opportunities for growth. And
Hmm.
so I began to think about this idea that slips and progress could coexist. And once I started to think more along those lines, I started to make meaningful progress in my recovery and stopped thinking that I needed to sort of attain this full recovery, right? I began to think maybe my recovery is just something that's going to be ongoing and something I have to keep working at. And so, in the middle place, many of us are better than we once were, but we're not all better. And we recognize that there's no finish line when it comes to recovery, because we do know that eating disorders can be very ongoing for folks and they can reach a better place in their recovery, but many of us don't ever fully recover. So the middle place is a more inclusive way of thinking about what it means to actually recover and heal from an eating disorder.
That's beautiful because it's hard. And I had those periods of times where I would be eater in the closet. I don't know how you call that, but I would hide my wraps or whatever I was eating so nobody would judge me. So I would go from throwing up and then I would be super hungry when I was okay, and then I would eat a lot and I would binge eating, and but then I would feel shame. So then I would grab all my wraps or everything that I ate and I would wash the dish so this didn't happen, but I knew it happened. And then I would go and weigh myself and I gained like 2 pounds and I was like mortified because I gained the 2 pounds, and it was a dance, 2 step forwards and 2 step backwards. And then you don't want to ask for help because you don't want to um, admit that you fail, that you slip, that you are back there, and you don't want to go to your mom or to whoever is with you and say, you know what, yes, I know you're paying for this doctor to help me, but I am sabotaging myself and I am doing all these things for myself. And I think the beauty of what we're talking is that not only we have to pay attention to the eating disorder when it comes to food, but also the impact in our mind, and how we can retrain our mind to give ourselves grace and talk nice to ourselves and say, it's okay. Tomorrow is another day and we're gonna do better tomorrow. And today, well, yeah, it was a flop. What we're gonna do? You know, let's try better. Do you
Mhm.
agree?
I do. I think that that's so critically important. And to say that to ourselves, but also to find someone we can trust who we can also share that with verbally,
Mhm.
because I think that's so important in just recovery is to be really honest about our slips with ourselves, but also feeling comfortable sharing them with a partner, with a therapist, whoever it may be. Because so often slips are shrouded in secrecy. And I think a lot of times it's our secrets that keep us sick and stuck. So for me, at least in my recovery, it's been really hard, but I try to let my spouse know and my therapist know when I've had these slips so that I can
Right.
really look at them and say, okay, what happened in that moment? Why did this happen? How can I get back on track?
Right. And understand that, look, you had that challenge when you were 11 years old, and now you're an adult and you still have moments in your life when you feel you going back to that period. And so definitely having grace and communicate our needs and ask for help is very important. And talking about sleep, which is your book, Life in the Middle of Eating Disorder Recovery, what my audience can find in that book.
Mhm. So the book really looks at my own experiences with anorexia nervosa and my kind of diagnosis, treatment, recovery from that. And it explores the middle place alongside my own story. But in many ways, I fit the stereotypical mold of someone with an eating disorder, and that I identify as a white woman. I live in a smaller body, I'm middle to upper class. And so I didn't want this to just be a book about my own story. I really wanted to bring in other points of relatability for readers. So I ended up surveying over 700 people from 44 states and 37 countries with lived experience with an eating disorder. And then I also interviewed 175 survey respondents and clinicians and researchers. So, alongside my own story, I weave in these perspectives from other people who have lived experience, as well as perspectives from researchers and clinicians who can talk about the latest research on eating disorders. So, it acts as both a resource for kind of care providers and caretakers, but also helps people with lived experience to recognize the different sort of pathways forward as they think about their own recovery. So this book has been a real labor of love, but I hope that it really helps people to think about what it means to recover in our society, and that it will help people to just really understand eating disorders better, because we know there are so many misconceptions around eating disorders and who they affect and who they don't affect. So I'm hoping to dispel some of those misconceptions in the book.
Yeah, and get curious, and start paying attention to our kids and our friends and see, okay, who's showing those signs, and maybe we need to hold space for them and give them the trust they need to open up and share with us what they're going through without any judgment. You're going on tour with your book. Can you share? Do you want to share what places are you going to be going to?
Yeah, so I'm really excited to just be in community and in conversation with people about the book. So I will be in Austin, Texas, as well as Houston and Dallas. I'll be in Boston, Massachusetts, Providence, Rhode Island, Santa Monica, California, St. Petersburg, Florida, New York City, Chapel Hill, North Carolina. So I'll be on tour in August and September mostly, and then have some other travel sprinkled in. But I would love for your listeners to join me, because it'd be so great to just have you all there and to sign your book for you and to meet you all.
Yes, absolutely. And I would have all your information in the description of the show so they can all follow you and get updates of where you're going to be. Mallory, thank you so much for being here. I think what you're doing is incredible, creating awareness, especially now when our image is so important. I think we need to be aware not only about the signs of an eating disorder, but how we express ourselves, how we talk to each other. Sometimes a joke is not a joke. And sometimes we're hurting people without knowing that we're hurting people. So I think you creating this awareness is going to help in so many different ways. And I am so grateful that you're here sharing your story.
Oh, well, I'm so grateful for the opportunity. Thanks so much.
Thank you all for listening to the Don't Shrink to Fit podcast. If you like this episode, please write a juicy comment below and subscribe to my podcast. Remember, we can only fly if we embrace each other. Until next week, be happy, be safe, and be kind to yourself.